You know what time it is. Time for another train wreck. Welcome to Not Another Baptist Podcast, a podcast exploring church revitalization, church planting, and other Southern Baptist goodies for your ear holes. I'm Matt Hensley, the pastor of May Hill Baptist, and I'm actually kind of freezing up here in the mountains. What about you, Kyle?
Well, I'm Kyle Bierman, the pastor of First Baptist Church Alamogordo, and I tell you what, it felt like fall this morning. For maybe the first time, I walked out on the back porch in shorts and a t-shirt, and it was not cool, but it's on the verge. So you can tell that fall's coming. It's not 1,000,000 degrees finally.
Yeah, Satan must be like taking the day off, I guess.
Yeah,
for you.
I guess so.
Like he's on vacation. Well, we're both pastoring fantastic churches in southern New Mexico and bringing this podcast to you so that you know what not to do as you learn from our mistakes. And this podcast is sponsored by the Christian Standard Bible. So you could say, as we often do, that we're the official podcast of the Word of God. We love the CSB because of its blend of readability and accuracy, and encourage you to check out the Bible that C.H. Spurgeon.
Yeah, do that again there.
Let's try that again.
Yeah. I'm not editing that out. That's just going to go, and you're going to...
It's just going to roll. C.H. Spurgeon used, and we love its blend of readability and accuracy, and encourage you to check it out at csbible.com after the show. Well, Kyle, what are we talking about today? Leave me alone. What are we talking about today?
Other than your heresy, we're talking about Susannah Spurgeon, who, to be frank, and let's be honest, I don't think you or I really know much about her at all, but we are thrilled today to welcome Ray Rhodes to the show. And Ray recently wrote Susie, The Life and Legacy of Susannah Spurgeon. Now, Ray, before we talk about Susie Spurgeon, let's talk about you. So tell us about your family, yourself, what you do other than researching the life of Charles Spurgeon's wife.
Well, hello, Matt and Kyle. Good to be with you today on Not Another Baptist Podcast. And I hope you guys are doing well. So my name is Ray Rhodes. I'm a pastor of Grace Community Church here in Dawsonville, Georgia. It's a Southern Baptist congregation we planted about 14 or 15 years ago now, and it still feels like a church plant in many ways. I'm married to Lori for 31 years, and we have 6 daughters, and 2 of my daughters are married. My oldest one with 4 children lives down the street. And my number 3 daughter was married over the weekend and married a Marine corporal, and they start their lives together. I guess they've started them now. And of course, some of you've probably met Abigail, right? You met Abigail through the Spurgeon Facebook, Susannah Spurgeon Facebook page.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So she's like really the brains behind the Susannah Spurgeon biography. She's almost 7 years old. So she's basically running the Susannah Spurgeon empire now that's developing. So that's, and I do Bible conferences, marriage retreats, various itinerant speaking as well. And I've been writing for a while. And you can ask me anything else about what I do. The folks are really probably don't care, but.
Well, I think it's an understatement of the century to say that all 3 of us married way out of our league, and we wouldn't be able to do what we do without the help of our wives, perhaps them keeping us out of trouble. I think especially Michelle and Rebecca, that's probably their primary focus, is just keeping us out of trouble. But I suspect the same might be able to be said for the Prince of Preachers himself, Charles Spurgeon, that I was actually able to say this time. And you believe that Charles and Susannah had an uncommon bond, especially given the scope, the publicity of their ministry, both with some of their health issues, the difficulties that they faced in life. What were some of the key aspects of their relationship that really bound them together so tightly through so many things that they faced?
Yeah. A couple of things come to mind. One is early in their relationship, Susie came to grips with exactly who it was she had married. She said if she had known really what sort of great man he was, she would have been much more intimidated even going into the wedding. And it sort of hit her, right between the eyes during their engagement. The church of Spurgeon's Church, New Park Street Chapel, is growing. Later, that becomes the Metropolitan Tabernacle. So we'll use those. This is the early church. And Spurgeon's fame is growing during their engagement. Spurgeon officially becomes the pastor at Metropolitan Tabernacle April of 1854. And by 1855, things are just going crazy. His fame is skyrocketing. Well, one evening, Charles and Susie were on the way to a preaching engagement at a place called the Horns, which was sort of an all-purpose facility, and they held various events there, including preaching. And the crowds were large. Charles helped Susie out of the carriage. They walked inside, and he totally forgot about her. And he just forgot her. And he was so focused on the task at hand, preaching. And so Susie was upset about that. In fact, she ran home. She only lived about a mile from the facility at that time. And she ran home to her mother crying. And her mother took her aside and helped her to understand exactly what it was like to be in the ministry. Though her mother was not, her father was not in the ministry, but she helped her to get some perspective of the kind of man Spurgeon was. And at the end of the sermon, as Spurgeon was leaving, he was looking for Susie, calling out for her, couldn't find her. And so he was upset. And so he got to Susie's home as fast as he could and went in the door crying out, "Susie, Susie." And the mother brought, Susanna's mother, Susannah, brought her down and worked things out between those two. And Susie soon after said, "I made it the intent of my life never to be a hindrance to him in his life and in his ministry." And so she settled it pretty early on. Even though it was very hard, she was lonely for him because he traveled quite a bit early on. And then later he's traveling for preaching and he was sick to get away. But yeah, so she settled it. They prayed together. Spurgeon led family worship wherever they were. And she describes that wherever they were, if they were on vacation, if they were at home, whenever they were together, they had family worship together. And then maybe just one other thing, and at this point, is they communicated. They wrote beautiful letters to each other. And Spurgeon wrote her every day that he was away. Like you guys probably do with your wives when you're away.
Yeah.
You're taking a dip pen and you're writing them a letter.
Absolutely. Felt pen everything. And, you know, they're so beautiful and poetic, and, you know, like roses are red, poems are hard, bacon is good. How about, I don't know. Like, it, yeah.
How about Lord?
Yeah, there we go.
So Ray, along those lines, it would probably be fair to say that Charles Spurgeon would not have been who we now know as Charles Spurgeon without Susannah. And so, I mean, you know, we see that she was his joy, his encourager, his partner in a lot of ways. But she also had her own ministerial impact and her own faith. So how should we consider her life and ministry and legacy, maybe first of all, in light of Charles's ministry, but then also independent of him?
Yeah, that's good. That's one of the things we attempted to do. Susie never wanted to be out of his shadow. She was content to be beneath Spurgeon's rather large shadow. And then she spent, after he died, she spent her remaining days promoting his legacy as well. So even her work was designed to keep her husband's ministry and name alive. So I think you're right. I don't know, you know, if he had not married Susie, it's hard to know, because I argue in the book that Spurgeon not only needed a wife, he needed a very specific wife. He needed Susie. And without Susie, he would not be the Spurgeon that we know today. I'm convinced of that. In fact, early in his ministry, and that may come up a little bit later, early in his ministry, he faced a tragedy of such significance that he almost quit the ministry and he almost died as a result of it. And he's just, this is 1856 in October, and he's only been in London a couple of years. So he's almost out of the ministry right off the bat. They've got two babies at home. And Susie's composure and faith during that time sustained him. One biographer argued, or at least made the point, that Spurgeon could have lost his mind after that, and through some of the other depressions that he faced, if he had not had such a wife as Susie. Another biographer talks about how she kind of smoothed out some of his uncouth ways And so like you guys, hopefully, that's why I wish your wives were here on this broadcast.
Yeah, Rebecca's still working on that with Matt.
Yeah,
all my uncouth ways
definitely.
have been taken care of. All mine are gone.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, she did. Spurgeon, while they were engaged, Spurgeon was encouraging her to be active in work and service, and he did that throughout. And so, about 10 years or so into marriage, Susannah's mostly homebound due to serious affliction, and it is from home in 1875 that she starts the pastor's book fund, Mrs. Spurgeon's book fund, and ultimately gives away 200,000 books.
Wow.
Before she dies in 1903, and she does that as an invalid, and so we've got that going on. And then Spurgeon dies in 18. So she writes one book in 1885 called 10 Years of My Life in the Service of the Book Fund. And so Spurgeon's alive during that time. That book is published. And then her second book is 10 more years, or 10 years after. That's it, 10 years after. And so that's written in 1895. And so it covers part of her time with Spurgeon, but it also covers the time of his death. And then she writes 3 other standalone books after his death, as well as being a significant contributor and editor of the massive 4-volume autobiography of Charles Spurgeon.
Wow.
And she's writing forward. She's editing The Sword and Trowel after he dies. And she plants a Baptist church. Again, sometimes she was so sick she could not lift her hand or her head. The pain was so severe. And yet she was a prolific author. She gave away books. She supported pastors with clothes and their families, money, started a church, the typical thing that most afflicted, sick, elderly, widow ladies do.
Wow.
She joins a long list of those that have done that.
Yeah.
What did you guys do this morning?
I drink about 6 cups of coffee. That's about the only productive thing I did today.
I spent an hour shaping young minds in an apologetics class, so I feel like I've got a leg up this morning. I've been about a month ago, I was given the first volume of his autobiography. I haven't read it yet, but that's on my to-do list. So I did not know, however, that she edited that. That's fantastic.
And was a contributor. She also co-edited it with his secretary, Joseph Harold, and but she contributed a lot of material herself to that, which was a very painful process for her. She was recounting their love and their marriage and those sorts of things. Now, I don't know which edition you have. The original was published in 4 volumes by Passmore and Alabaster, and people ask me all the time, what do I need to get? And I would say get the autobiography of Spurgeon. So originally Passmore and Alabaster in 4 volumes. That is reproduced in its entirety by Pilgrim Publications, the guys who did the 63-volume set. You can get an abridgment of that. The Banner of Truth 2-volume is an abridgment. It's very good, and that's sufficient for most people, unless you're a nut and a nerd like me who needs every detail of that we can find of Spurgeon's life. So that's I've got the 4 volumes contained in 2 large volumes by Pilgrim, but it's all good. That's where you need to start for both of those guys, to learn about both of them. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Ray, if you know Matt as well as I know him, there are some words that you could use to describe him, and those might be unique and challenging, but maybe not always in a good way. So, but I think that's true of a lot of pastors, right? I mean, we live unique lives, and in a lot of ways you face unique challenges, not just in ministry, but in marriage as well. So what was it, and you've touched on this a little bit, but elaborate a little bit more. What was it that made Susie such a good partner for a uniquely gifted, but also maybe challenging man like Charles Spurgeon? Yeah.
Well, Susie, it's an amazing thing to me that she was not converted until probably late 1852. And so she's born in 1832. So 20 years old is when she sort of dates her conversion. So she's unmarried. She's not met Spurgeon at that time. She is converted under the preaching of Romans chapter 10. And yet she says that's the dawning of the true light of her soul. But she immediately says that she falls into a backslidden kind of situation. And she keeps her profession to herself. She doubts. She's cold spiritually. And so, it's questionable whether that was actually a true conversion or not. Maybe, I think it was. But so for a good year, over a year, she struggled in that condition. And then she, and we'll talk about how she met Spurgeon. I think you're going to ask me about that a little later. But she meets Spurgeon, and then a few months after, he learns of her spiritual struggles and gives her a copy of the Pilgrim's Progress, which used to be, it won't be anymore after Susie comes out. It used to be one of the top selling Christian book, but I'm going to displace Bunyan. And Susie begins to grow under Spurgeon's leadership. And her growth is significant that within a few months later, she shares her testimony, and he is stunned at the depth of her understanding of the scripture and the gospel. And it is, you can read in the writing, you can see just how taken aback Spurgeon is. He said, I knew you were a true child of God. I didn't know, in essence, that it was this deep. And so from her conversion in late 1852 till April of 1854, she's struggling. And then within a few months, really, she is taken off. And so the only thing I can contribute to that is that she was raised in a home and in a culture where Bible reading and prayer was sort of a staple items in every home, whether it was on the veneer or in the heart of things. And so when the Lord converted her, and especially when she began growing a bit through Pilgrim's Progress and Spurgeon's leadership, it's like the Holy Spirit took the kindling of those years of Bible reading and prayer and just lit it, and she took off. She took off in growth. So she's growing spiritually. She's very mature early in the marriage. They suffered together early in the marriage. And so she prays for her husband. She's patient with him. And later she begins reading to him. He would come home depressed after Sunday. Every preacher knows what it's like on Sunday to preach and empty yourself. You read yourself full and study the word, and you get full and you empty it all out, and you go home and you're empty again with lots of things on your mind. And Spurgeon did that as well. And so she would read to him. She would read poetry. George Herbert was his favorite. And when he felt that he had been not as faithful as he ought to have been in preaching, she would read Richard Baxter to him, which they both would weep together. And she wept. He wept because of his conscience was so sensitive. She wept because she loved him. And that's what the account says, simply because she loved him. So she was sold out to Spurgeon as her husband, sold out to Spurgeon as a minister of the gospel. She was faithful to pray for him. She did things that encouraged him, such as reading to him. And on one situation, when Spurgeon, a subscriber to Spurgeon's ministry, donated, was a regular donor, and then disagreed with Spurgeon over his stand in the downgrade controversy, withdrew their support. That person told Susie about, that person sent Spurgeon a letter. Susie read the letter first and then wrote her husband and said, I read the letter and I laughed out loud because I know who supplies all of our needs. Mm-hmm. So that's the sort of wife that he had. And she didn't allow her own affliction to hinder Spurgeon's ministry. And we can talk about how Spurgeon dealt with that later if you want to, how he ministered to her. So I've been asked the question, for example, he doesn't seem like such a good husband. He's got a sick wife at home. He's gone a lot. And what about all that? So, but anyway, that's some of the things that make Susie the right wife for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And really along those lines, as we wrap up, obviously a book focused on Susie is going to show us how Susie stands out in her own ministry. You've shared about the book club and some of that kind of stuff. But as you really think about that sort of balance of the home, that's probably a very attention point for all of us? Do we spend too much time at home at the sake of our churches, or do we spend too much time at the church at the sake of our home? And, finding that right balance for everybody. We recently had a podcast on parenting and pastoring where, when you step into the pulpit, you don't stop being dad. And sometimes there's some comical things that happen while you're doing that require you to be dad in that moment. So we talked about that. But as we begin to wrap up this first part of our interview and thinking about the many pastors and the pastor wives that are listening to our show, before they all go out, as we know, to buy this book and begin reading it every year, just like Spurgeon with Pilgrim's Progress and all of that, in what ways did Susannah help Charles in ministry and in life more specifically? You've talked about kind of on the ministry, maybe she tilted his head the right direction. And as you just shared, maybe how she laughed out loud at what was being sent to him. How did they work together as a couple to make life, ministry, and him better?
Yeah. Well, early in her ministry, she was very active in church. She was physically able to. And she worked with him in ministry at the church by really giving the oversight to female baptismal candidates. So she ministered to them, counseled them, and they left testimony behind of what that meant to them. So that's how she sort of specifically helped him in the church. She managed the oversight of a very busy home. The Spurgeon home was not just Charles and Susie, and then when their children were born in 1856, it became an increasing place of industry, not only ministry, but they had they had milk cows, and they had other they had a milk business, an egg business kind of thing going on. They had flowers that they grew later that were gathered to get to poor people. And they had servants. By the time Spurgeon died, they had at least 9 servants, probably full-time servants. Now, that's not slaves, that's servants, meaning household employees. I'm sure you guys probably have several folks that you employ to help you in your home or with your ministry and various.
Several.
Yeah, they're called children. That's unpaid labor. That's what they.
Yeah, but they were dressmakers because we had, the staff was cared for. These folks lived here and for the most part would live there. Early in their marriage, she traveled with him as well, and so they loved being together. They walked together on the property. They, as I've mentioned, they read together, read out loud together, prayed together. She helped him with his study. He'd bring her in on a Saturday night and say, get me this commentary, read something to me from, Thomas Brooks or one of the Puritans. Most of his library was either by the Puritans or about the Puritans. So he was a Puritan through and through.
2018 is a different era. Era. It is. It's an error too. Some weirdos, here's the error. Some weirdos preach from pub tables while sipping pumpkin spice lattes. But what were the most pronounced and difficult pressures of being married to the most famous preacher of the Victorian era and perhaps even of all time?
Yeah. Well, there were several, as we mentioned a little bit in last week's podcast. Spurgeon's fame was skyrocketing pretty early in their relationship. The church is filling up. Spurgeon is getting requests to preach all over the place. He's writing. He's gone from home increasingly, and that was one of the early stresses that Susie felt, even after she had made the commitment to not be a hindrance. One day he was about to leave for a journey, and she started crying a bit, not in complaint or in defiance or anything, just she was sad. And Spurgeon talked to her about that and talked to her about the sacrifice of ministry, and she received that well. And it was not a rebuke from Spurgeon so much as it was just a gentle reminder of the life that God had called them to. But she missed him all of her marriage, and she would sit behind his desk and do her own writing and her own work as much as she could there. And while she was sitting behind his desk, looking at his stuff, she thought of him, and she writes a lot about those experiences in his study writing. So that was it. But both of them suffered from physical affliction, Susie and then Charles as well, pretty early on. I mean, Charles always, I think, always is a long time, but early in his London life, even pre-London, he suffered with depression at some level. After the great music hall disaster that probably most of your listeners are familiar with, that happened in October of 1856, he fell into severe depression, and he suffered from severe depression the rest of his life. But he fought it by faith. He was not content to sort of live in the slough of despond. He fought his way out by faith and prayer, and he never lost the faith, and he was a very joyful man in the midst of such suffering. But he suffered from essentially inflammation of the kidneys, gout, as well as other sicknesses, and that contributed to his weight issues. He was overweight, and he died. And he was involved in 5 major controversies in his ministry that are cataloged in Ian Murray's book, The Forgotten Spurgeon, which is must reading. And the last controversy, Susie believed, cost him his life, the downgrade controversy in the late 1800s. So just some of the pressures that she felt as his wife. Yeah.
Wow.
And early on, financial challenges, believe it or not. I mean, they were a young ministry family, and Spurgeon they were giving money away to help train ministers early on as well. So, yeah.
Wow. Well, all 3 of us are parents. I have 2 kids. Matt has 4. And you have some kids that are young. And then, as we talked about last week, you recently had a daughter that got married as well. And so in light of the importance that we all place on our children and our families and our ministry, what influence did Susannah have in raising up the 2 Spurgeon sons to be in ministry?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, she had the greater influence because she was with them more often. Now, they revered their dad. Son Charles Jr., if you will, he was asked by one of his friends, a biographer, if he would write a biography of his dad. And he said he couldn't because hero worship was too much of a threat. And he didn't feel he could write an objective biography because he so revered his father. And yet, there's also discussion in some books that a bit of distance at times between Charles and the boys, not because of a lack of love, but just the nature of Charles's life and ministry. But he loved the boys. But Susie cared for them most of all. And when they're young, Susie was not often able to attend on Sunday evening. She would stay home with the boys and train them in the faith. And she played the piano. She would sing with them. But she wouldn't allow them to sing portions of hymns that declared that there was as if a Christian's making a confession of faith, because she wanted them to be people of integrity. And they later rejoiced to be able to sing the full hymn and not just portions of it as they came to faith in Christ. But neither of them came to faith. The moment of conversion was not at Susie or Charles's feet, but others led them to Christ like that. Both give their parents great credit, and both said, in essence, that they really owe their salvation, humanly speaking, to their mother, Susie. Yeah. So she taught them the word, she prayed for them, and she led them to Christ, though not at the moment of conversion. Oh, you want me to keep on?
No.
I can talk for hours.
We had that was my pause right there. We will edit that part out.
Yeah, we will edit the pause.
My question really goes back to maybe kind of the very beginning. We know that they were obviously raised in particular manners, all of that kind of thing. But Rebecca and I were set up essentially on a blind date at a Denny's. And the wedding was planned by the end of that day, not by my choice, but by the people that had set us up on that trip. And it was the most awkward 2 or 3 hours of my life. Hopefully, their story is a little better, a little more romantic, or maybe a little more special than a Denny's while drinking sweet tea and eating pie. Tell us how Charles and Susie met and just got everything underway in the very beginning.
Yeah. And if you had gone to a Waffle House, it probably would have been more romantic. But you guys
This is true. Yeah.
instead. So we in Georgia, we highly recommend Waffle House. I guess you guys have those out there too, don't you?
We do.
Okay, good. That's important to clarify early on in this interview. Yeah. So actually, Susie's first impression of Charles was not favorable. She was not a member of the New Park Street Chapel, but she had attended with her parents some. She was at the home of one of the deacons and leaders of the church and his family, and they went on Sunday morning, but she did not go. The first time Charles preached at the tabernacle, just as a guest preacher, and the church was without a pastor. So this is December the 18th, 1853. Charles is there Sunday morning, Sunday night. Sunday morning, he's not impressed. He's ready to get out of there. He wants to go back to Water Beach, where his people loved him, and there's more people at the little village church in Water Beach than the historic Baptist church in London, once the largest church in England, largest Baptist church in England, but had declined to just a couple of hundred people, and not even that many there at the service when Charles spoke. But Thomas Olney, the deacon, and his family she was staying with, their family was excited about Spurgeon's morning sermon. And so they went out in the afternoon and gathered people to come back and almost, just about fill the place up, and brought Susie with them. They got her to come. She didn't really want to go, but she loved them. So she went on their account because she had heard reports of the morning service. Now, you got to understand, you guys probably can relate to this. Susie was cultured. She was highly educated. She was refined. She was a city girl. London and Paris was the sort of air that Susie breathed. And so Charles was none of those things. He was a country boy raised in Puritan country. And he loved his grandfather's farm. He was more at home on his grandfather's farm than he was in any city. So he's a country boy. He doesn't have the kind of clothes that Susie has. He doesn't have the manners that she has. He doesn't have the accent that she has, even. And his hair looks funny. He says bizarre things, in her mind, bizarre things from the pulpit. They're just uncouth. And she doesn't appreciate it because she's used to more refined pastors at the historic New Park Street Chapel. So she doesn't understand that why folks are so excited about him. And later she testifies it was because of her own spiritual coldness. So, but she writes about his hair. She writes about his tie, his handkerchief that he waved in the air, like the old time Baptist preachers would do, and just offended by him. So that's December. So let's move this down the road quickly. So December, by April, this is when Spurgeon has learned, and so the people love him at New Park Street. They invite him to come back. He's still a pastor in north of London in Water Beach. And eventually he's there sort of on a trial basis at his request. But by April, he becomes the formal pastor of the New Park Street Chapel, and he's left Water Beach at that time. But about a week before he becomes the pastor, he's learned of Susie's condition. He gives her a book. He inscribes it to Susie with prayers for your progress in faith. And she begins to grow and spend more time with him, and he's counseling her, helping her with her spiritual struggles, but no hint of romance in any of that. And it seems that Susie's pretty unaware of any feelings that he may have been developing during that time. So we've got April. Now we come to June. There's the opening of the Crystal Palace, the great exhibition in South London. A group from the church are going to go to that and watch the grand procession that night. Charles and Susie are there with the group. They're not there together. They happen to be seated together. Now, that could have been arranged. Spurgeon was a very sly guy like that, and you'll see in a moment. But he, as they're sitting there, he whispers in her ear, and he's holding a book, Martin Tupper's Proverbial Philosophy, and he opens to a page with a little poem called On Marriage. And it talks about praying for your spouse. And Charles whispered to Susie, "Do you pray for him who is to be your husband?" Now, she got it. Instantly, she knew what he was saying. Her face turned red. Her heart started beating rapidly. Spurgeon said, "Could we take a little walk?" And so they made their way away from their group and the crowd, and they walked outside and walked down by the lake where there's these extinct creature models that were early dinosaur models that are still there, by the way. You can walk by and see the same place. She talks about how love bloomed that night. And again, her rapid heartbeat, her blushed face, all the excitement that she felt. So April, she's struggling spiritually. June, Charles has revealed his feelings for her. Move up to August, he asked her to marry him in her grandfather's garden. So we're not even a year from when she thought he was a country bumpkin to now she's saying yes, and she goes upstairs and prays and thanks God for the love of such a good man. So there, I mean, that's just a little bit of their love story as it gets started. All within less than a year, this has happened.
Man, now in your book, you refer to Susie as the great sufferer, and what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, that phrase I pulled from, I think, Charles Ray, and it should be in quotes in the book. But she was a great sufferer. They were married in 1856, and from all accounts, she was relatively healthy. They had twins in October of that year. Some argue that she began suffering soon after that, but I don't accept that argument. And the reason I don't is because there are accounts of Susie traveling with Charles and hiking across the Alps. So typically people with bad health or great sufferers are not hiking the Alps. And that was, I mean, I almost fell out of my chair when I started reading about Susie Spurgeon mountain hiking the Alps. Spurgeon now, he's in the carriage with his, his editor or someone talking theology or books. And Susie's out in front of the carriage, looking at the sights and talking about how much she enjoys walking the Alps. So that kind of stuff is going on until 1856 or so. And I've got her church records around this time, and she's active in church. But in 1867, her activity begins dropping off, and it's noted, I believe, then that she's sick. And by 1868, her traveling days are over. Basically, her church attendance is over. She's suffering intense pain. I tried every way that I could to discern exactly what type of physical problems she had. Everyone asked me that question. I couldn't figure it out completely, except for this. She had surgery by one of the most famed gynecologists of that time. And so we're almost certain it was some sort of female issue. They never had children again, and likely they would have, because children were very valued in that culture, and Charles and Susie loved that. And she suffered from 1868 till 1903 when she died. Wow. Her mother died young. Her mother died at 57. Her aunt died young, so it could have been some hereditary disease, and maybe because of Susie's surgery and other things, she was able to live longer until 70 or 71 that she lived to. But she suffered. Now it got somewhat better around the time of Spurgeon's death. She made a great trip with him and had a great time until he died. But she continued to suffer throughout. Yep.
And I think that's a good time to ask this question, because we try to remember the need to lighten up. Church is stressful. We may battle depression or splits or whatever it might be in the church or in our home, whatever, all the different things that can weigh down a ministry. So we try, and that's one of the reasons we have this podcast, to help pastors lighten up just a little bit, to take ministry seriously, but not ourselves too seriously. And in the book, you described the marriage of Susannah and Charles as quote unquote fun. What is it about their marriage that bred so much life and enjoyment and quote unquote fun into it? Because I suspect it's not going to be like me dousing cold water over the shower or giving my wife a wet willy, things like that. Like, she's not a fan of that. That's not how she would describe it fun. So how would you say, what was it about their marriage that bred so much life and enjoyment and fun into it all?
Yeah. Well, as I think I mentioned earlier, they love to be together, and they would talk and walk and laugh. Spurgeon, I read a Spurgeon sermon to our church on Sunday night. I've never done that before. I told them that I was doing it, And they were mesmerized by that. I think they want me to do that every time now. They think it's much better. But as I'm reading that, I'm picking up throughout, as you have reading Spurgeon, the humor that he was a very, very funny guy, and he loved to laugh, and he could tell a great joke, very appropriate. I mean, he wasn't inappropriate, but he was criticized at one point in his ministry for his humor. And he said to the person, he said, if you knew how much I hold back that I want to say, you would commend me for my humor. So his humor, the fact that they both were well read, they had so many things that they could discuss at such a level. They both enjoyed, Susie increasingly enjoyed the countryside. So just they loved being together. They learned to they cultivated their love by spending that time together when he was in town, by writing love letters to one another when they were away. They never stopped courting. In fact, one of the early academic studies on, well, not one of the earliest, but it's one of the few academic biographies of Spurgeon done, I think, in the early 80s by Patricia Kruppa. It's not necessarily great, but it's got some good pieces in it. She argues, not argues, but she mentions, I'm still in the doctoral program, I'm arguing everything. She argues, she's defending, but she points to the fact that even as they were older, they were like two teenagers in love, walking hand in hand at the Crystal Palace, the way they did the night Spurgeon shared his feelings for her. So they just never got over the wonder of their love and marriage to each other. Yeah. They kept it fresh. Yeah.
All right, Ray. So as we close here, what is Susannah's lasting legacy? And here's the challenge in one sentence. So, sum up her legacy in one sentence.
Yeah, that's what my folks want me to do at church when I preach.
Matt's too.
Yeah, definitely.
Her legacy is that she poured her heart and life in extending her husband's legacy. That's what she wanted to do more than anything else. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Wonderful. Well, that really can't be the last question though, Kyle, because we need to tell our folks where they can buy Susie, the Life and Legacy of Susannah Spurgeon. So Ray, where can people find this wonderful book?
Well, I want to say, first of all, Matt, have you heard of Lifeway?
I'm vaguely familiar. They've been asking me to be the president recently.
Oh, that's right. I forgot.
Yeah, I'm trying to do a little research.
They better not ask me for a recommendation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, did you put me on the resume for that? Yeah. And you and I think you guys have been lifelong Southern Baptists, as I have. I was born in Southern Baptist Church, and so far they've not kicked me out of Southern Baptist world. That could happen at any moment. But Lifeway, we appreciate that. I want to mention them first because I know they're a huge part of this program through you, CSB Bible, which you guys are CSB only, right? You guys, yeah. Right?
We've burned all of our other. No, I'm just kidding.
I don't know
just
what you're talking about.
If we wanted to give a shout out to Lifeway and CSB, I'm sure that no one would mind in your world. So I'm thankful for Lifeway. I think they're going to feature Susie in some way when it's released very soon. But also, if you go to susiespurgeon.com, you get a lot of resources there, as well as how to buy the book in various places and ways that you can do that.
And we're going to put all of that in the show notes as well, and where they can follow you on Twitter. I've really enjoyed that because I wake up in the morning, kind of go through the Susie Twitter profile and read some of the little stories that you throw in there, the quotes or whatever. That kind of whet my appetite for the book, and then got to read that. That was really wonderful. And so we'll throw all of that in the show notes, and so check that out. And I definitely do not want to, but it is time to jump off of the train until next time. We're grateful that you took the time to listen in today, and we hope that you learned a lot about the life of Susannah Spurgeon over the last few weeks, and perhaps whet your appetite to go out and buy that book. But if you liked what you heard, we also ask for your support in giving us a 5-star review so we keep these coming to your ear holes. You can visit us online at www.notanother.baptistpodcast.com, or on Twitter at NAB_podcast, or on Facebook under Not Another Baptist Podcast. But until next time, send us out.
Until next time, may your coffee be as black as night and as bold as the gospel you declare.
Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Ray. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. And I do want to ask you maybe next time, both of you guys, how you guys have dealt with, like Spurgeon, how you dealt with the fame of being podcast. And now Matt is a big wig at Lifeway.
Yeah, that's right.
As a prolific author. Everyone knows that you guys are movers and shakers in the Southern Baptist Convention, and that both of you are being considered for the presidency at Southwestern as well as the presidency at Lifeway. So, I mean, you guys probably understand better than I do, and
overwhelming.
How Charles may have dealt with some of those things. But back to why we're here: to sell books, to make millions. No. So Susie Spurgeon, wife of this great man who Spurgeon authored 135 books, 63 volumes of sermons, and that's not all of them. Edited a monthly magazine and did numerous book reviews every month. Read 6 substantive volumes a week. He wrote hundreds of letters a week, and he did all that and died at 50. It died at 57. And I was stunned when I was doing doctoral work. I did it on my thesis on their spirituality of Charles and Susannah Spurgeon. I was stunned that no one had ever done a book on their marriage, and no one had ever done a book on Susannah. Full biography. In 1903, there appeared a little biography by Charles Ray on the life of Susannah Spurgeon. Very good, and it's helpful. Everybody should have that as a companion. But it's a small, short book. So this is Susie, the life and legacy of Susannah Spurgeon, is the first ever full biography of the wife of the Prince of Preachers. And as you mentioned earlier, it's not just her life in conjunction with Spurgeon, it's her life as a faithful, godly woman, and how even in severe affliction, we're not talking about head colds, we're talking about severe affliction, that she served God faithfully. And we learn how she dealt with loneliness, how she dealt with suffering, how she dealt with brokenness, as well as the joys and sorrows of life, the death of grandchildren, 2 of her grandchildren at least, and other significant events. So she is a model for godliness, both for men and women. By the way, it's not, even though women buy most of the books in America, it seems from the stats I see, it's not a book just for women. It's a book for pastors, pastors' wives, Christian men and women, and even younger people. Yep.
Well, I can promise you, if I somehow, meaning that the rapture happens and I'm the only one left behind and I end up as president of Lifeway, we're going to have a Susie bobblehead, Susie doll, Susie plush toy, Susie, you know, the little Lottie Moon cutout thing, like the life-size Lottie Moon that's like 2 feet tall. Like we're going to have that, but for Susie. That's coming to a store near you. But as much as